Hey there, welcome to Bread Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I don't know exactly when the nightmares began, but they arrived without warning, creeping into our sleep like uninvited guests who refused to leave. They started as brief, fragmented images, just fleeting glimpses of something dark and foreboding. But the longer we worked near Elena Vasquez, the more vivid and terrifying they became. Eventually, they evolved into the kind of dreams that wake you in the dead of night, drenched in cold sweat, your heart pounding so violently you can't remember where you are for several disorienting moments. Alina's name appeared on our patient roster quietly. Like so many others who find their way into the psychiatric ward at Riverside Mental Health Facility, there was no dramatic fanfare, no unusual circumstances surrounding her admission, just another troubled individual who had slipped into our system through the complex network of emergency interventions and court-ordered evaluations. Her diagnosis was listed as severe catatonic schizophrenia, with episodes of dissociative behavior. Nothing particularly extraordinary in our line of work. She had been placed in isolation since her arrival 3 weeks earlier. A standard protocol for patients who might pose a risk to themselves or others, while we worked to stabilize their medication and assess their long-term treatment needs. We had seen our fair share of patients with mysterious mental illnesses, conditions that seemed to defy conventional psychiatric understanding. But Elena Vasquez was different in ways that became increasingly difficult to ignore. She never spoke, not even a single word during her entire stay with us. Her eyes were always distant and unfocused, as though she were permanently lost in some internal world that existed far beyond the boundaries of our physical reality. Every now and then, she would murmur something under her breath, soft whispers that none of us could ever decipher. But it was never coherent enough to provide any insight into her psychological state. The nursing staff took turns attending to Elena's basic needs, each of us quietly wondering if there was something more complex lurking beneath her withdrawn demeanor and obvious emotional disturbance. Her blood work showed nothing unusual. Her physical examinations revealed no underlying medical conditions, and her brain scans appeared completely normal. Yet there was an undeniable sense that Elena was connected to something far more sinister than a simple psychiatric disorder. Then the dreams began, and everything changed dramatically. It started with me during my 3rd week of caring for Elena. At first, I thought it was nothing more than job-related stress, the emotional weight of working with severely mentally ill patients finally manifesting in my subconscious mind. But the dream was far too vivid, too detailed, too specifically terrifying to be dismissed as ordinary work-related anxiety. The dream was always exactly the same, with no variation in setting, imagery, or emotional intensity. I would find myself standing in a completely empty room with stark white walls and no furniture, no windows, no decorations of any kind. In the center of this barren space stood a single door, painted deep crimson red, dark and ominous like dried blood against the sterile backdrop. Behind that door always behind that mysterious red door, came the sound of an infant crying. It would start as a soft, pitiful whimpering, the kind of sound that immediately triggers every protective instinct you possess. But gradually, inevitably, the crying would grow louder, more desperate, more urgent, until it became an agonized wailing that seemed to echo through my entire being. The cry would reverberate through the dream space, haunting and persistent, creating an overwhelming sense of dread that felt more real than any nightmare I had ever experienced. When I would finally wake up, usually around 4 in the morning, I initially dismissed it as nothing more than exhaustion manifesting in strange ways. But when the same dream returned the following night, and then again the night after that, I began to worry that something more serious was affecting my mental health. This time, the feeling wasn't just discomfort or unease. There was a deep, gnawing sense of terror, as if the red door itself was somehow calling to me, inviting me to approach it despite every instinct screaming that I should run as far away as possible. But I wasn't the only staff member experiencing these disturbing nocturnal visions. Over the next several days, more and more of our team began reporting identical dreams to Dr. Patricia Wells, our chief psychiatrist. Nurses, orderlies, security guards, even the housekeeping staff who cleaned Alina's isolation room, all of them spoke of the same vivid imagery. A red door standing alone in an empty white room, and behind it, the desperate crying of a baby. No one had initially shared their dreams with one another, but somehow every detail matched perfectly. The door, the baby's increasingly frantic cries, the overwhelming feeling of being drawn towards something we couldn't understand, but knew instinctively was dangerous. It was Alina Vasquez, who seemed to be the common denominator, the one connection that linked all of us to these shared nightmares. She hadn't said a single word about the dreams, but there was something in her dark eyes that made it clear she knew exactly what was happening to us. She seemed completely unaffected by the whispered conversations in the hallways, by the growing unease that was slowly infecting the entire psychiatric ward like a contagious disease. It was as if she was watching and waiting for something specific to occur, some predetermined event that only she could see coming. In the days that followed, the psychological tension in our facility grew almost unbearable. We tried our best to ignore the supernatural elements and continue providing professional care for Alina, even though the haunting images of that red door had begun to spill over into our waking lives. We would walk into patient rooms, and for just a split second, see a crimson door standing in the corner where none should exist. It was clearly an illusion, a trick of exhausted minds and overstressed nervous systems. But the collective nature of our experiences made it impossible to dismiss as individual psychological breakdowns. When multiple people begin seeing the same impossible things, it becomes much harder to maintain your grip on rational explanations. But then something far more disturbing occurred. The baby's cry, that heart-wrenching sound that had haunted our dreams for weeks, began to manifest during our waking hours. I was walking down the main corridor, heading toward Alina's room to check on her evening medication, when I heard it clearly. A soft, pitiful sound that was unmistakably the cry of an infant in distress. The sound was faint at first, barely audible above the usual background noise of the psychiatric facility, but undeniably real. I froze in the hallway, my heart beginning to race as I tried to determine where the crying was coming from. It seemed to be emanating from inside Alina's isolation room, but that was impossible. There were no babies in our facility, no infants anywhere in the building. I rushed toward her room, my pulse pounding in my ears, expecting to find some logical explanation for what I was hearing. But when I pushed open the heavy door, there was nothing unusual inside. Alina was lying on her narrow bed, her eyes closed, her breathing steady and regular. No baby, no red door. Just Alina resting peacefully in the dim light, filtering through the small window. But the air in her room felt different somehow. It was thick and heavy, charged with some unseen energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. I stepped back out into the hallway, unsure of what I had just experienced, and looked around at my colleagues. I could see it in their faces immediately. They had heard the crying too. They had felt the same inexplicable weight settling over the entire ward. From that point forward, everything began to deteriorate rapidly. One by one, staff members started calling in sick, not with physical ailments, but with complete psychological exhaustion. They couldn't sleep, couldn't function normally, couldn't escape the weight of dreams that seemed to be leaching into their minds and growing stronger with every passing hour. It wasn't just fatigue or ordinary work-related stress. It was as if those nightmares were somehow feeding on our collective consciousness, drawing energy from our shared experiences, and becoming more powerful, more invasive, more terrifying with each night that passed. Dr. Michael Harrison, who had been working the longest shifts and spending the most time directly with Alina, was the first to completely break down. He arrived at work one morning looking like he hadn't slept in days, his eyes sunken and bloodshot, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he tried to review patient charts. He claimed that the red door had followed him into his waking life, that he could see it constantly now, always standing just at the edge of his peripheral vision. He became obsessed with the idea that there was actually a baby trapped somewhere behind that door, something that Alina was connected to, something that needed to be freed from whatever supernatural prison was holding it captive. His increasingly wild theories grew more elaborate and frightening as the hours passed. He insisted that Alina had been the key to unlocking whatever malevolent force lay behind the red door, that her silence was actually a form of psychic containment, designed to keep something terrible from escaping into our world. "The baby will cry again," he kept muttering over and over, even after the other doctors placed him under sedation for his own safety. "And when it does, when it cries loud enough, that door will finally open, and we'll all understand what Alina has been protecting us from." We tried desperately to maintain our professional composure and keep the psychiatric facility functioning normally. But Alina's room had become the epicenter of something we couldn't control or understand. Patients who were housed near her, even those who had no direct contact with her, began experiencing the same terrifying symptoms. The nightmare spread like a psychological contagion. The baby's crying became more frequent and more urgent, and that ominous red door began appearing in everyone's dreams and waking visions. I remember the last time I saw Alina before she was transferred to a more secure facility. I stood by her bedside, watching her dark eyes flutter open with that same strange calmness that had characterized her entire stay with us. There was a knowing look in her gaze, an understanding that I couldn't place or comprehend. I gathered my courage and asked her directly if she could hear the baby crying, if she could see the red door that had been tormenting all of us for weeks. But Alina only smiled faintly and shook her head slowly, as if the question itself was somehow misguided. "It's not for you to see," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but filled with an authority that made my blood run cold. "Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some cries are meant to go unanswered." Those were the only words Alina Vasquez ever spoke during her time at Riverside Mental Health Facility. The next morning, she was found dead in her isolation room, with no warning signs, no changes in her vital signs, no explanation for why her heart had simply stopped beating during the night. But even in death, Alina carried the weight of that mysterious red door with her. The baby's crying stopped immediately after she passed away. The nightmares faded from our collective unconscious, but the psychological scars remained. Those of us who had been exposed to whatever supernatural force Alina had brought into our facility were never quite the same again. We never understood what Alina Vasquez really was, what she had become during her time with us, or why she had drawn us all into her terrifying nightmare. The crying baby, the red door, the shared dreams that defied all rational explanation, all of it disappeared when she died. But the fear remained, along with the uncomfortable knowledge that we had encountered something far beyond our ability to understand or control. The truth is, I don't know what Alina did to us during those weeks, or why she chose to infect our dreams with images of doors we were too afraid to open. But the thing that haunts me most, even now, months later, is the thought that maybe we were never meant to wake up from those nightmares. Maybe Alina's death was the only thing that saved us from discovering what really lay behind that crimson door. What was making that baby cry with such desperate urgency? Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone with my thoughts, I still hear it faintly in the distance. The soft crying of an infant behind a door that exists somewhere between dreams and reality, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to turn the handle and step inside. There are certain patients who leave an indelible impression on everyone who encounters them. Individuals whose very presence seems to defy the natural order of human vulnerability and medical science. Victor Kane was exactly that type of person, a man whose physical condition and remarkable health history had become something of a legend among the medical staff at Riverside Mental Health Facility. He possessed an almost supernatural immunity to illness that had fascinated doctors and nurses for years, making him the subject of countless medical studies and informal discussions about the limits of human resilience. Victor's medical records read like something from a science fiction novel, rather than a legitimate patient file. He had never experienced so much as a common cold during his entire 43 years of life, had never required antibiotics for any kind of infection, and had never shown any signs of the countless viruses, bacteria, or parasites that routinely affect the general population. His immune system functioned at levels that medical science considered theoretically impossible, fighting off potential illnesses with an efficiency that left infectious disease specialists baffled and intrigued. We had seen our share of remarkably healthy individuals over the years. Professional athletes in peak physical condition, health enthusiasts who followed strict dietary and exercise regimens, people with naturally robust constitutions who rarely required medical intervention. But none of them had ever demonstrated the kind of complete, absolute immunity to illness that Victor Kane displayed on a daily basis. His skin seemed to glow with an inner vitality that made him appear years younger than his actual age. His muscle definition was extraordinary, sculpted and maintained without any apparent effort or special training regimen. He radiated physical health in a way that felt almost unnatural, like a man who existed outside the normal boundaries of human biological limitations. There were persistent rumors throughout the hospital that Victor had never been sick a single day in his entire life, that he could fight off any virus, bacteria, or disease with an ease that bordered on the miraculous. The kind of man who seemed capable of surviving anything that the medical world could throw at him. Victor had been admitted to our psychiatric facility for observation after a routine psychological evaluation revealed some concerning irregularities in his mental state, though nothing that appeared to be immediately dangerous or requiring intensive intervention. The intake paperwork described episodes of mild paranoia and social anxiety, conditions that were relatively common and typically responded well to appropriate medication and therapy. His physical examination showed some unusual variations in his blood chemistry, but nothing that our medical team considered alarming enough to warrant immediate concern. As a precautionary measure, Dr. Patricia Wells had decided to keep Victor under observation for 72 hours. Standard protocol for patients whose psychological profiles didn't fit clearly into established diagnostic categories. We thought it would be a simple, straightforward case. Monitor his behavior, adjust his medication if necessary, and discharge him back to outpatient care once we had a better understanding of his specific therapeutic needs. I was assigned to the night shift that evening, working my usual midnight to 8 schedule in the psychiatric intensive care unit. It had been a relatively quiet evening, with most of our patients resting comfortably and no emergency situations requiring immediate attention. The usual routine of medication distribution, vital sign monitoring, and periodic wellness checks had proceeded without any unusual incidents or complications. But by the time I made my final rounds before dawn, it was already evident that something was terribly, inexplicably wrong with Victor Kane. When I walked into his room to check on his condition, I paused at the doorway, squinting in disbelief at what I was seeing. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that perhaps the combination of artificial lighting and fatigue was creating some kind of optical illusion that would resolve itself once I moved closer to his bed. But there was no mistaking what was happening to Victor's body. The man who hadn't experienced so much as a minor skin irritation in over 4 decades was now covered in massive, angry boils that had erupted across his chest, arms, and neck with shocking suddenness. Each pustule was enormous, swollen and pulsing with internal pressure, unlike anything I had ever encountered in my years of psychiatric nursing. This wasn't just a severe skin reaction or allergic response. This was something else entirely, something that defied every medical principle I had learned about dermatological conditions and immune system responses. I rushed into the room, a sense of profound unease settling heavily in my stomach as I tried to process what I was witnessing. Victor was sitting upright in his hospital bed, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with confusion and growing panic. But remarkably, despite the horrifying appearance of his skin condition, he didn't seem to be experiencing significant physical pain. His vital signs were stable, his breathing was regular, and his overall demeanor suggested bewilderment rather than acute medical distress. "Nurse," he said, his voice hoarse but still strong, "what the hell is happening to me? I've never been sick before, never had anything like this. My body has always been able to fight off everything." I moved closer to examine the boils more carefully, trying to maintain my professional composure while internally struggling to understand how such a dramatic medical crisis could develop so rapidly in someone with Victor's legendary immune system. The pustules seemed to be growing larger even as I watched, expanding and darkening, as if they were feeding off some internal source of infection that was spreading throughout his entire circulatory system. I immediately activated the emergency call system to summon additional medical personnel. But I didn't wait for them to arrive before beginning my own assessment of Victor's condition. I started checking his vital signs, reviewing his recent medication history, and trying to identify any possible triggers that might have caused such a severe and sudden reaction in someone whose body had never shown any vulnerability to illness. There was no fever, which was unusual for someone experiencing such an obvious infection. His heart rate was elevated, but not dangerously so, and his blood pressure remained within normal ranges. His temperature was actually slightly below average, which made no medical sense given the obvious signs of systemic infection that were manifesting across his skin. Just as I was preparing to consult with the attending physician about possible treatment options, the first scream tore through the room with such intensity that it made me jump backward in shock. It was a sound of pure, primal agony that seemed to come from somewhere deep within Victor's chest. A cry of pain so profound that it felt like it was reverberating through my own body. I spun around to look at Victor, and his expression had shifted dramatically from confusion to something approaching absolute terror. His face was contorted in agony as he suddenly gasped for air, his chest tightening visibly as some kind of internal pressure began building throughout his respiratory system. Then, as if responding to some invisible signal, the boils began to rupture with sickening wet sounds that filled the room with an overwhelming stench of decay and corruption. With each pustule that burst, the air became thicker and more toxic, as if the very atmosphere was being poisoned by whatever malevolent force was destroying Victor's previously invulnerable immune system. I stepped back toward the door, horrified by what I was witnessing, but unable to look away from the impossible transformation taking place before my eyes. Victor's body, which had been a monument to perfect health just hours earlier, was now deteriorating at a rate that defied every principle of human biology and medical science. I could see other nurses and medical staff gathering in the hallway outside Victor's room, their faces reflecting the same mixture of disbelief and fear that I was experiencing. Some of them were whispering among themselves. Others were simply staring in shocked silence, unsure whether they should enter the room or maintain a safe distance from whatever contagious horror was consuming our previously healthy patient. The nurses who had been working at Riverside the longest began to move away from Victor's room slowly, as if they instinctively understood that whatever was happening to him posed a threat that extended beyond normal medical protocols. These were experienced psychiatric professionals who had seen every kind of medical emergency and patient crisis imaginable. But something about Victor's condition triggered a primitive survival instinct that overrode their clinical training. By midnight, it had become clear that none of us were equipped to handle what was happening to Victor Kane. His body continued to transform in ways that challenged everything we understood about human physiology, infection, and immune system function. The boils had spread to cover virtually every visible area of his skin, and each new eruption brought with it a wave of toxic discharge that made the room increasingly difficult to enter safely. I watched through the observation window as Victor's legendary immunity finally collapsed completely, his body succumbing to some kind of supernatural plague that seemed designed specifically to target and destroy the very qualities that had made him unique among human beings. Then, at the stroke of midnight, something even more horrifying occurred. Rebecca Martinez, a young nurse who had only been working at Riverside for a few months, made a decision that would haunt the rest of us for years to come. Despite the obvious dangers and the clear instructions to maintain distance from Victor's room, she entered the contaminated area in what appeared to be an attempt to provide direct medical assistance. I didn't witness the initial moment of contact, but I heard the explosion that followed. A wet, violent sound as one of Victor's larger boils ruptured with tremendous force, covering Rebecca in a spray of dark, corrupted fluid that seemed to possess its own malevolent properties. The scream that escaped from Rebecca's throat was even more blood-curdling than Victor's earlier cries of agony. But what came next was infinitely worse than any sound she could have made. Rebecca, the vibrant young woman who had been smiling and joking with colleagues just hours earlier, began convulsing violently as her skin started to rot and decay before our horrified eyes. She clawed desperately at her face and neck, trying to stop whatever necrotizing process was consuming her living tissue. But her efforts were completely futile. Within minutes, she had collapsed to the floor of Victor's room, her body lifeless, and already beginning to show the same signs of advanced decomposition that had characterized Victor's final transformation. The other nurses and medical staff who had remained in the hallway turned and fled immediately, some running toward the exits, others collapsing against the walls in shock and terror. They couldn't process what they had witnessed, couldn't reconcile the scientific impossibility of what had occurred with their understanding of medicine, biology, and the basic laws of nature. By sunrise, every member of the night shift staff had submitted their resignations. No one could provide a rational explanation for Victor's rapid deterioration or Rebecca's instantaneous death. And no one was willing to risk remaining in a facility where such inexplicable medical horrors could occur without warning. The authorities eventually sealed Victor's room and conducted extensive investigations into the incident, but they never discovered any identifiable pathogen, toxin, or environmental factor that could account for what had happened during those final midnight hours. Victor Kane, the man who had been completely immune to every known form of illness, had somehow become the epicenter of a plague that defied all scientific understanding. I don't think any of us will ever forget the sight of Victor in those final moments, watching his perfect immune system turn against itself with a fury that seemed almost personal, almost vindictive. His body had become something unrecognizable, a mass of corrupted tissue and toxic discharge that bore no resemblance to the healthy, vibrant man who had been admitted to our facility just days earlier. The most terrifying aspect of the entire experience wasn't just witnessing the destruction of someone who had seemed invulnerable to human weakness. It was the realization that immunity, no matter how complete or miraculous, could be stripped away in an instant, leaving even the strongest among us completely defenseless against forces we couldn't understand or control. Sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I still see Victor's face during those final hours, twisted in agony as his body betrayed everything he had believed about his own invincibility. And I wonder, in the silence and darkness of my own vulnerability, how many of us are truly immune to the things that wait patiently in the shadows, ready to remind us that no one, absolutely no one, is safe from the mysteries that lurk just beyond the boundaries of human understanding. After spending nearly 8 years as a radiology technician at Riverside Mental Health Facility, I had learned to expect the unexpected. Medical equipment occasionally malfunctions without warning. Patient files sometimes get misfiled in the chaos of busy shifts, and important documents have a tendency to disappear at the most inconvenient moments possible. It's all part of the unpredictable nature of working in a psychiatric facility, where the combination of long hours, complex cases, and constant emergencies creates an environment where small mistakes and oversights are simply part of daily life. But this particular incident, this one strange occurrence that took place during a routine night shift, still haunts my thoughts and challenges everything I believed about the logical, orderly world of medical documentation. Even now, months later, I've never been able to shake the unsettling feeling that something, or perhaps someone, was deliberately playing elaborate tricks on me that night. It started like any other evening shift in the radiology department. I was working alone, which wasn't unusual for the midnight to 8 in the morning schedule. Most of the facility's X-ray needs occurred during regular daytime hours, so the overnight technician typically handled only emergency situations and the occasional routine scan that couldn't wait until morning. The department was almost eerily quiet, with just the soft, constant humming of the imaging equipment and the occasional rustling of paperwork to keep me company during those long, solitary hours. It was well past 2 in the morning, when the world outside seemed to have completely settled into silence, and the night shift at Riverside had fallen into its familiar, predictable rhythm. I was stationed in the main radiology suite, a sterile, fluorescent-lit room filled with expensive diagnostic machinery, and rows of carefully organized filing cabinets that contained thousands of patient imaging records dating back several decades. I had just finished processing the evening's batch of chest X-rays, routine scans that Dr. Andrew Cross had ordered for several patients in the psychiatric intensive care unit. Nothing particularly challenging or out of the ordinary, just standard documentation required for patients who were being treated with medications that could potentially affect their respiratory or cardiovascular systems. I methodically placed each developed film into its designated folder, made detailed notes in the departmental logbook, and stored everything neatly in the appropriate sections of our main filing system. It was all completely routine, the kind of systematic work I had performed thousands of times before without giving it much conscious thought. But as I was cleaning up my workstation and preparing to take a short break, I realized I needed to retrieve a specific X-ray film for an urgent consultation that Dr. Cross had requested for the following morning. A patient named James Mitchell had been experiencing unusual chest pains, and the doctor wanted to compare his most recent scan with films taken during his admission 2 weeks earlier. I walked over to the filing cabinet where I had just stored the evening's completed work, checked the appropriate alphabetical section, and found nothing. The Mitchell films weren't there. I checked the slot again, thinking perhaps I had misfiled them under the wrong letter. But there was no trace of the X-rays I clearly remembered processing and storing just 20 minutes earlier. I retraced my steps carefully in my mind, trying to recall every detail of my filing routine. I was absolutely certain I had developed the films correctly, placed them in the proper protective sleeves, labeled them with the correct patient information, and filed them in their designated location. The system we used was simple and straightforward, designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of confusion. The filing cabinet was well organized and maintained, with clearly marked sections and a logical alphabetical arrangement that made it virtually impossible to lose or misplace important documents. I had been using this same system for years without ever experiencing a significant problem. So the sudden disappearance of the Mitchell X-rays made no sense whatsoever. I spent the next 15 minutes conducting an increasingly frantic search throughout the entire radiology department. I checked every counter surface, every desk drawer, every possible location where the films might have been accidentally placed. I examined the floor around my workstation, thinking perhaps they had fallen and slid under one of the large pieces of equipment. I even checked the waste containers, wondering if I had somehow thrown them away by mistake during my cleanup routine. Nothing. The X-rays had completely vanished, as if they had never existed in the first place. My frustration gradually transformed into genuine bewilderment as I continued searching. This wasn't simply a case of misplacing something in the normal chaos of a busy medical facility. I was absolutely certain about my actions, confident in my memory of the filing process, and completely unable to explain how 3 large X-ray films could simply disappear from a locked, secure room where I had been the only person present. Finally, I decided to take a short break from the search, hoping that stepping away from the problem might help clear my mind and provide a fresh perspective on the situation. I walked down the hallway to check on a few other departmental responsibilities, reviewed some pending paperwork in the adjacent office, and tried to convince myself that there had to be a logical explanation for what was happening. When I returned to the radiology suite approximately 20 minutes later, I expected to resume my search with renewed determination and hopefully better results. I wasn't feeling particularly optimistic, but I knew I had to be thorough and systematic in my approach to finding those missing films. And then there they were. The Mitchell X-rays were sitting right there on the main counter, in the exact spot where I had just spent 15 minutes searching with meticulous care. They were arranged neatly in their protective sleeves, properly labeled, completely undisturbed, as if they had been placed there by someone who wanted to ensure I would find them immediately upon my return. My heart skipped several beats as I stared at the films in complete disbelief. This was absolutely impossible. I was certain, beyond any shadow of doubt, that I had checked that counter surface multiple times during my search. It was the most obvious location, the first place anyone would look for missing X-rays, and I had examined every square inch of that area at least 3 times. I picked up the films with trembling hands, almost afraid to touch them, and held them up to the light to verify they were indeed the correct Mitchell scans. Everything appeared normal: clear images, proper exposure, correct patient identification numbers, no signs of tampering or alteration. They were exactly as they should have been, exactly as I remembered developing them earlier in the evening. But how had they gotten there? How had 3 large X-ray films simply materialized on a counter that I knew with absolute certainty had been empty just minutes before? I stood there in the fluorescent lighting of the radiology suite, trying to process what had just occurred. Had I somehow missed seeing them during my frantic search? Had I been so focused on other areas of the room that I had overlooked the most obvious location? But that explanation felt inadequate, insufficient to account for the systematic thoroughness of my search process. The alternative possibilities were even more disturbing to consider. Had someone else entered the radiology department while I was away? Someone who knew exactly where to find the missing films and chose to return them to the most visible location. But that scenario raised even more questions. Who would have access to the department after hours? Why would they take the films in the first place? And how could they have known I was looking for them? The security system at Riverside was comprehensive and well-maintained. All entrances to the radiology department were monitored and required authorized keycard access. I would have been immediately notified if anyone else had entered the area, and there had been no alerts or security notifications on my pager or computer terminal. I couldn't explain what had happened, and the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. It felt like a glitch in reality, like the normal rules of cause and effect had somehow been suspended for just long enough to create an impossible situation. The universe seemed to have played some sort of elaborate practical joke on me, but I couldn't understand the purpose or meaning behind such a strange occurrence. I left the radiology department soon after that discovery, but a profound sense of unease had settled over me like a heavy blanket. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to find some rational explanation that would make sense of the disappearing and reappearing X-rays. Was I simply more tired than I had realized? Had the stress of working long night shifts finally begun to affect my perception and memory? But no matter how many times I analyzed the situation, I couldn't convince myself that I had made a simple mistake. The search had been too thorough, too systematic, too careful for me to have simply overlooked something so obvious. Over the following weeks, I found myself paying much closer attention to the small details of my work routine. I became hyper-aware of every file I processed, every document I stored, every piece of equipment I used. I was searching for patterns, looking for signs that might help me understand whether the Mitchell incident had been an isolated occurrence or part of some larger, more mysterious phenomenon. There have been several more occasions since then when I've noticed things slightly out of place in the radiology department. Nothing as dramatic or obvious as the vanishing X-rays, but enough small discrepancies to make me question whether I'm simply becoming paranoid, or if there really is something unusual happening in our facility after midnight. Sometimes I'll find patient files that I'm certain I left in one location, only to discover them neatly arranged somewhere else entirely. Other times, pieces of equipment that I remember shutting down at the end of my shift will be running when I arrive the next evening, humming quietly as if they had been operating continuously for hours. Most unsettling of all are the moments when I feel like I'm being observed. Late at night, when I'm alone in the radiology suite, I'll sometimes sense a presence just outside my peripheral vision, as if someone is standing in the shadows watching me work. I'll hear soft footsteps in the hallway, or catch a glimpse of movement reflected in the glass surfaces of the equipment. But when I turn to investigate, there's never anyone there. I've learned to live with these minor mysteries, to accept them as part of the strange atmosphere that seems to permeate Riverside Mental Health Facility during the overnight hours. After all, I have important work to do. Patients who depend on accurate diagnostic imaging, and responsibilities that extend far beyond trying to solve supernatural puzzles. But every now and then, usually around 2 in the morning when the facility is at its quietest, I'll think back to that night when the Mitchell X-rays vanished and reappeared without explanation. I'll remember the feeling of holding those films in my hands, knowing with absolute certainty that they had been somewhere else entirely just moments before. And I'll wonder if I'll ever truly understand what happened in those strange, impossible minutes. Maybe it was just a glitch in my memory, a momentary lapse in concentration caused by fatigue and too many years of working night shifts in a psychiatric facility. Maybe the stress of caring for mentally ill patients had finally begun to affect my own perception of reality in subtle but significant ways. But deep down, in the part of my mind that remains open to possibilities beyond rational explanation, I know there was something more to that incident. Something or someone had intervened in the normal flow of events, had taken those X-rays and returned them in a way that defied all logical explanation. And no matter how many times I review the facts, no matter how many alternative theories I consider, I'll never forget the feeling that I wasn't alone in that radiology suite, that invisible eyes were watching my confusion with amusement, and that the mysteries of Riverside Mental Health Facility run far deeper than any of us who work there during the daylight hours could ever imagine. It was well past 2 in the morning when the world outside seemed to hold its breath, and the night shift at Riverside Mental Health Facility settled into its familiar rhythm. I was working alone at the main reception desk, one of those shifts where time moves like thick honey and every sound echoes through the empty corridors. The facility was old, built in the 1970s, with walls that had absorbed decades of whispered conversations and floors that creaked under the weight of countless footsteps. I had grown accustomed to these quiet hours, filling out patient charts, updating medication logs, and double-checking treatment schedules while the skeleton crew made their rounds through the wards. The patients were all secured in their rooms, resting, or at least I hoped they were. But that night, That particular night felt different from the moment I stepped through the front doors. I had just finished logging the evening's incident reports and was focused on organizing the patient files. It was one of those shifts where I could almost feel the tension of the day slowly melting away from my shoulders. Everything seemed calm. Everything was in its proper place. And I was just trying to get through the last few hours before the morning shift arrived to relieve me. Then it happened. Without any warning, as if some invisible force had decided to announce its presence, the entire filing cabinet erupted in chaos. The metal drawers didn't just slide open, no, they flew out with tremendous force, as if pushed by unseen hands. Patient files scattered through the air like autumn leaves caught in a violent windstorm. Papers fluttering and dancing before they landed scattered across the linoleum floor. For a moment, I sat frozen in my chair. It didn't make any sense. The filing cabinet was securely anchored to the wall, a heavy steel unit that required considerable effort just to open a single drawer. No one had been anywhere near it to cause such chaos. And yet there it was, an undeniable mess, as if the room itself had decided to turn everything upside down. My heart began to race as I quickly glanced around the reception area. My eyes darted over the empty hallway, searching for any explanation. There was nothing. No one had entered through the security doors. No windows were open to blame on a sudden draft, and the air conditioning system hummed its usual quiet tune. Everything was still and silent, yet the files had exploded outward with such violence it was as if something had deliberately hurled them across the room. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as a cold chill ran down my spine. I had been working in mental health facilities for years, had seen my share of emergencies, patient outbursts, and the general chaos that comes with this line of work. But this was something entirely different. This was something I couldn't explain, couldn't rationalize, couldn't file away in my mind as just another strange night at Riverside. I didn't stick around to analyze what had happened any further. I grabbed my belongings, my purse, my clipboard, anything I could carry, and I was out of that reception area faster than I ever thought possible. I practically ran down the corridor to the nurses' station in Ward B, my heart still pounding in my chest, my hands shaking as I clutched onto anything that felt real, anything that felt solid. I don't know how long it took me to reach the other station, but I remember every hurried step, every frantic breath. When I arrived, the other staff members looked up from their paperwork, confused by my sudden appearance and the obvious panic written across my face. "I'm not staying at the main desk alone," I insisted, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound calm. "Not tonight. Something just happened that I can't explain." Maya Rodriguez, the head nurse, immediately stood up and walked over to me. She was one of those experienced nurses who had seen everything the facility could throw at her, but even she looked concerned when she saw the state I was in. "What happened, Catherine?" she asked gently, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I told her about the filing cabinet, about the way the drawers had exploded outward for no apparent reason, about the papers scattered everywhere like someone had thrown them in a fit of rage. As I spoke, I could see the skepticism in her eyes gradually giving way to concern. Maya had been working at Riverside longer than anyone, and she knew that sometimes this old building seemed to have a mind of its own. I had been working in psychiatric facilities for years. had witnessed countless unusual situations and learned to handle the unpredictable nature of mental health care. But never had I experienced something so completely unexplainable. That night, I insisted on staying with the team for the rest of my shift. I wasn't going back to that reception desk alone, not after what I had witnessed. I never did find a reasonable explanation for what happened that night. Maintenance checked the filing cabinet the next morning and found nothing wrong with it. The drawers opened and closed normally, the mounting brackets were secure, and there were no signs of mechanical failure. Everything was exactly as it should have been. But after that night, I couldn't help but wonder if Riverside Mental Health Facility had its own secrets, its own troubled history that maybe didn't want to be left undisturbed. Whatever force had caused those files to explode across the room, it didn't seem to want me to forget what I had seen. And truth be told, even now, months later, I haven't forgotten a single detail of that terrifying night. It was a quiet night in the intensive care unit at Riverside Mental Health Facility. The kind of night where everything feels suspended in time, as if the world outside is moving at a different pace than we can comprehend. The soft hum of ventilators mixed with the occasional beeping from monitors, and the hushed voices of nurses as they moved through the dimly lit rooms. All part of the careful rhythm we had learned to navigate during these difficult hours. But some nights carry more weight than others. Some nights, the burden of what we witness feels heavier than usual, and you can't shake the feeling that something fundamental is shifting. Something beyond our understanding is taking place right before our eyes. That's exactly how it felt as I walked through Ward C that particular evening. I was reviewing patient charts near the nurse's station when I noticed the overhead light in room 307 flicker slightly. It was subtle, barely noticeable. But after years of working in this facility, you develop an instinct for when something isn't quite right. I had been caring for Marcus Freeman for almost 2 weeks now, a man in his early 60s who had been admitted for severe depression with psychotic features that had progressively worsened over the past month. Marcus had been drifting in and out of consciousness for several days, barely able to keep his eyes open for more than a few moments at a time. The medication adjustments weren't having the effect we had hoped for, and his condition seemed to be deteriorating despite our best efforts. But I had grown attached to him, drawn to the quiet dignity he maintained, even as his mind battled against invisible demons. I walked into his room prepared for the usual routine, checking his vital signs, adjusting his position to prevent bed sores, and monitoring his response to the latest round of antipsychotic medications. But as soon as I stepped inside, I noticed something dramatically different. Marcus was not only awake, but his eyes were wide open, staring at something far beyond the walls of his small room. "Marcus," I said softly, moving closer to his bedside, "how are you feeling tonight?" He turned his head slowly toward me, and there was a slight tremor in his weathered hand as he reached out. I gently grasped it, offering what comfort I could. His skin felt cold, colder than it should have been given the warmth of the room. "I saw it," he whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "I saw my name written on the wall." I paused, uncertain of what he meant. The walls of the intensive care unit were plain white, sterile surfaces where no names could appear. But there was something in his voice, a deep sincerity that I couldn't simply dismiss as another symptom of his psychotic episodes. "What do you mean, Marcus? What name did you see?" I asked, leaning closer to catch every word. He looked directly at me then, his eyes focusing with an intensity I hadn't seen from him in weeks. It was as though he was summoning every ounce of clarity from the depths of his troubled mind. "It was right there," he said, lifting a shaking finger toward the wall behind me. Written in large, dark letters, my full name, Marcus Edward Freeman. He paused, taking a long, labored breath. And underneath it, there was a date, today's date. A chill ran through me as I turned to look at the wall he was pointing toward. There was nothing there, of course, just the same blank white surface that had been there for years. But something about the certainty in Marcus's voice, the absolute conviction with which he spoke, made it impossible to dismiss his words as mere hallucination. "I know what this means," he continued, his voice growing stronger despite his obvious physical weakness. "I know I'm not going to see another sunrise. The writing on the wall, it's a message, a warning of what's coming." I was taken aback by the intensity of his words. I had seen patients say strange things during their darkest hours, had witnessed the mind's ability to create vivid illusions when reality became too difficult to bear. But something about the way Marcus spoke, the weight of absolute certainty in his voice, felt different from anything I had encountered before. "Marcus, you're in good hands here," I said gently, trying to offer reassurance while my own mind struggled to process what he was telling me. "Dr. Wells and the entire team are working hard to help you get better." But he wasn't listening to my words of comfort. His gaze had drifted again, his focus moving beyond me, beyond the room, as if he could see something that existed in a dimension I couldn't access. "I'm tired," he murmured, his voice fading to barely more than a whisper. "I've been fighting this darkness for so long, and I just don't have the strength anymore." And just like that, he closed his eyes and drifted back into unconsciousness. I stayed with him for a while longer, sitting quietly at his bedside with my hand resting gently on his arm. It was a peaceful moment, and yet it felt like time had slowed to an almost unbearable crawl. His words echoed in my mind, heavy with a meaning I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. The night wore on, and I checked on Marcus several more times before my shift ended. Each time I entered his room, he remained unconscious, the monitors beeping softly, the room feeling exactly as it always had. But something fundamental had changed. There was an undercurrent of finality in the air, a sense that we were witnessing the quiet conclusion of something much larger than any of us could comprehend. The next morning, I returned to the facility for my early shift, walking down the familiar hallway with the weight of the previous night's conversation still heavy in my thoughts. As I approached room 307, I saw the medical team gathering outside, their faces marked by a quiet seriousness that I recognized all too well. I knew immediately what had happened. I stepped inside, and there he was, Marcus Freeman, lying peacefully in his bed with his eyes closed and his hands folded neatly over the thin hospital blanket. The machines that had monitored his vital signs throughout the night were now silent. He had passed away in his sleep, just as he had somehow known he would. It was peaceful, remarkably peaceful. I stood by his side, my mind replaying his words from the night before. He had known, had seen something that gave him a glimpse of the end that was approaching. Something I couldn't explain, but felt deeply in my heart, told me that Marcus had been granted a moment of clarity in his final hours, a brief window into whatever lies beyond our understanding. I said a quiet prayer for him then, standing in the stillness of that small room. And as I left, I couldn't help but wonder, had Marcus truly seen his name written on the wall? Or had it been nothing more than the final hallucination of a troubled mind? But deep down, in the way he had spoken with such calm acceptance, in the absolute certainty that filled his voice, I knew that Marcus Freeman had been given something rare and precious in his final night. He had been allowed to know, to understand, to prepare for the transition that awaited him. I carried that moment with me throughout the rest of my shift, moving from patient to patient, caring for those who were still fighting their own battles with mental illness. But I couldn't escape the feeling that Marcus had taught me something profound that night, something about the mysterious connection between the mind and whatever exists beyond our physical existence. Sometimes, when death approaches, there is a knowing, an understanding that transcends our normal perception of reality. And sometimes, even when the mind appears broken, the soul remains aware of truths that the rest of us can only glimpse in our most sacred moments. Midnight at Riverside Mental Health Facility represents a unique transformation that occurs within our walls every single night. It's the time when the usual chaos and intensity of psychiatric care gives way to an entirely different atmosphere, when the bustling energy of the day shift fades into the quiet, contemplative rhythm of overnight operations. The emergency intake area sees fewer crisis admissions. The long corridors become almost deserted, and the constant background noise of patient interactions is replaced by the gentle hum of essential medical equipment and the soft footsteps of skeleton crew staff members making their rounds. As a night shift radiology technician, I had grown deeply accustomed to this nocturnal world, this parallel universe that exists within the same physical space, but operates according to completely different rules and expectations. It's a realm where time moves more slowly, where shadows seem deeper and more mysterious, where the boundary between the rational and the inexplicable becomes increasingly blurred with each passing hour. But there was one recurring phenomenon that I never managed to understand or explain. No matter how many months passed or how many times I experienced it firsthand, it was a mystery that challenged everything I thought I knew about hospital procedures, patient documentation, and the basic laws of reality itself. The first time it happened was approximately 4 months ago, during what had started as a completely routine evening shift. I was working alone in the main radiology suite, as was typical for the midnight to 8 schedule, when the computer terminal at my workstation chimed softly to indicate an incoming scan request. This wasn't unusual in itself. Emergency situations and urgent diagnostic needs don't respect normal business hours, and psychiatric patients often require immediate imaging studies during crisis episodes. I clicked on the notification to review the details of the requested procedure, expecting to see the standard information that accompanies every legitimate medical order. Patient name, identification number, attending physician, specific type of scan needed, and clinical justification for the imaging study. What appeared on my screen was something I had never encountered before in all my years of working in medical facilities. The request was for a comprehensive full-body X-ray scan, scheduled for exactly 12:00 a.m. But there was absolutely no patient identification information included anywhere in the digital order. No name, no medical record number, no date of birth, no contact information, no attending physician's signature. Nothing at all that would allow me to verify the legitimacy of the request or locate the patient who was supposed to receive the imaging study. I double-checked the computer system, convinced that this had to be some sort of administrative error or technical glitch. Hospital procedures were extremely strict about unauthorized medical procedures, and performing any kind of diagnostic imaging without proper documentation and patient consent could result in serious legal and professional consequences. Every scan request had to include complete patient information, physician authorization, and clear clinical justification before any technician was permitted to begin the procedure. But despite the obvious irregularities, the request had somehow been processed through our normal scheduling system, and the X-ray equipment had already been automatically prepared for the specified scan time. The machines were powered up, calibrated, and ready to begin imaging, as if everything was proceeding according to standard protocol. After several minutes of indecision, unsure of what the appropriate response should be to such an unusual situation, I decided to proceed with the scan. I reasoned that I could always contact the administrative office afterward to clarify the missing patient information. And there was always the possibility that some kind of computer system error had simply failed to display the proper documentation. I prepared the radiology suite for the incoming patient, ensuring that all equipment was functioning properly and that the imaging protocols were set correctly for a full-body scan. Then I waited for someone to arrive, expecting that a nurse or orderly would escort the patient to the radiology department and provide the missing identification details that weren't included in the computer request. But when midnight arrived, no one came to the radiology suite. No patient, no escort, no explanation for the mysterious scan request that had appeared in our scheduling system. I waited for several additional minutes, thinking perhaps there had been a delay in transporting the patient from their room to the imaging department. But the hallways remained empty and silent. Finally, I decided to proceed with the scan anyway, partly out of curiosity, and partly because the equipment had already been prepared and was ready to operate. I activated the imaging sequence and waited for the results to appear on my monitor, expecting to see either an error message or perhaps an empty scan showing only the imaging table and surrounding equipment. What appeared on my screen took my breath away and challenged everything I understood about medical imaging technology. The scan revealed a complete human skeletal structure, but these weren't normal, healthy bones that you would expect to see in a living patient. Instead, the images showed an entire skeleton that appeared to be incredibly ancient, weathered, and deteriorated in ways that suggested centuries of age and environmental exposure. The bones were jagged around the edges, discolored in several places, and showed clear signs of advanced decomposition that would be completely impossible in a living person. I zoomed in on different sections of the skeletal structure, examining the individual bones more closely to try to understand what I was seeing. The arm bones, in particular, displayed a level of deterioration that could only occur over extremely long periods of time. There were visible cracks, chips, and unusual markings that appeared to have been caused by decades or even centuries of natural weathering processes. This made absolutely no sense from any medical or scientific perspective. The patient had to be alive and present in the scanning room for the X-ray equipment to produce these images. But the skeletal structure I was observing belonged to someone who had clearly been dead for an extraordinary length of time. The level of bone deterioration suggested a person who had died at least 200 years ago, possibly much longer. I ran the scan a second time, convinced that there had to be some kind of technical malfunction or equipment error that could explain these impossible results. But the images that appeared were identical to the first set. Ancient, decomposed bones that defied all logical explanation for their presence in a modern medical imaging study. As I studied the results more carefully, I began to notice something even more disturbing than the age and condition of the bones themselves. The skeletal figure in the images wasn't completely static, as you would expect from X-ray scans of a motionless patient. Instead, it appeared to be shifting slightly, as if the person being imaged was moving or adjusting their position during the scanning process. I leaned closer to my monitor, focusing intently on the subtle movements I thought I was detecting in the bone structure. At first, I attributed these apparent changes to eye strain or fatigue from staring at the bright screen for too long. But as I continued to observe, the movements became more obvious and deliberate, as if the skeleton was actually walking or shifting its weight from one foot to the other. This was when I noticed something that made my blood run cold and sent shivers of terror down my entire spine. For just a brief moment, barely visible in the shadowy areas of the scan, I could see the faint outline of a human face. It wasn't just the skull that you would normally see in skeletal X-rays, but an actual face with features, expressions, and what appeared to be eyes that were looking directly at me through the imaging system. The face was only visible for an instant, vanishing completely when I tried to focus on it more closely or adjust the image settings to get a clearer view. But there was no mistaking what I had seen. Someone or something was aware that they were being observed and was looking back at me through the X-ray equipment. I immediately checked with the front desk and security department to see if anyone had signed in as a patient or visitor during the past hour. But there were no records of anyone entering the building who wasn't already accounted for in our normal patient census. It was as if this mysterious individual had materialized out of thin air, submitted to a medical scan, and then disappeared without leaving any trace of their presence. I didn't mention what I had experienced to the other staff members initially, partly because it sounded too impossible to believe, and partly because I was beginning to question my own sanity. Could the stress and isolation of working night shifts in a psychiatric facility finally be affecting my mental health? Was I experiencing some kind of psychological breakdown that was causing me to see things that weren't really there? But the scan requests continued to appear in our computer system with clockwork regularity. Every night at exactly midnight, the same type of order would show up. Full body X-ray, no patient identification, no physician authorization, just a timestamp and a request for immediate imaging. I began to develop an almost compulsive need to understand what was happening during these mysterious midnight scans. I started arriving early for my shifts and staying late, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was submitting these unusual requests, or perhaps witness something that would help explain the impossible images I was capturing night after night. The bones in the scans never changed significantly, but they became increasingly familiar to me with each passing week. I started to recognize specific patterns of deterioration, particular areas of damage, certain unusual characteristics that appeared consistently in every image. It was as if I was developing a personal relationship with this ancient skeleton, learning to identify it like you might recognize an old friend. One night, approximately 3 weeks after the midnight scans had begun, I decided to take a more proactive approach to solving the mystery. I positioned myself in the hallway outside the radiology suite before midnight, determined to see who or what was entering the scanning room to create these impossible images. I waited patiently as the clock approached 12:00, watching the empty corridor and listening for any sounds that might indicate someone was approaching. The facility was quiet, as it always was during the overnight hours, with only the distant sounds of essential medical equipment and the occasional footsteps of nurses making their rounds in other parts of the building. At exactly midnight, the computer terminal in the radiology suite chimed to indicate another scan request, just as it had every night for the past month. But I was positioned where I could see both entrances to the imaging area, and no one had passed by my observation post. The hallway remained completely empty, yet somehow the scanning equipment had received another mysterious order. I walked into the radiology suite, my heart racing with a combination of excitement and apprehension, ready to confront whatever supernatural phenomenon was responsible for these nightly visitations. The room appeared completely normal. Bright fluorescent lighting, familiar medical equipment, the same sterile environment I had worked in for years. But as I approached the X-ray table, where patients normally position themselves for imaging studies, I felt a dramatic change in the atmospheric pressure and temperature. The air became noticeably colder, thick and heavy, with some kind of invisible energy that made the hair on my arms stand up and sent chills throughout my entire body. I activated the scanning equipment and watched as the images began to appear on my monitor screen. The ancient skeleton was there, just as it had been every night, but this time something was fundamentally different about the entire experience. Instead of remaining motionless, the skeletal figure appeared to be standing upright, as if it had risen from the scanning table and was now positioned vertically in front of the imaging equipment. As the scan progressed, I could see the bone structure shifting and moving with increasingly deliberate, purposeful motions. It was no longer the subtle movements I had observed in previous weeks, but dramatic changes in position that suggested the skeleton was actually walking around the scanning room, possibly even approaching my location behind the protective barrier. Then, in a moment that will haunt my dreams for the rest of my life, the face appeared again in the scan images. But this time, it wasn't just a brief glimpse or a shadowy outline that disappeared when I tried to focus on it. The face was clearly visible, obviously human despite the ancient condition of the surrounding bone structure, and it was definitely, unmistakably smiling directly at me. The smile wasn't friendly or reassuring in any way. It was the kind of expression that suggested knowledge of secrets I wasn't meant to understand, awareness of realities that existed beyond normal human perception. The eyes in that ancient face seemed to look right through the imaging equipment, through the protective barriers, directly into my soul with an intensity that made me feel completely exposed and vulnerable. I staggered backward from my workstation, my knees buckling as the full impact of what I was witnessing finally hit me with overwhelming force. This wasn't a malfunction of medical equipment or a psychological breakdown caused by work-related stress. This was something supernatural, something that existed outside the normal boundaries of life and death, something that had somehow gained access to our facility and was using our own diagnostic equipment to communicate with the living world. The lights in the radiology suite began to flicker erratically, creating a strobing effect that made the room feel even more surreal and threatening. I could hear footsteps behind me, soft but clearly audible sounds of someone walking across the linoleum floor. But when I spun around to see who was there, the room remained empty. The skeletal figure on my monitor began to move again, and this time I was certain that I could see it actually standing upright, no longer lying on the scanning table, but positioned vertically as if it were a living person, rather than the remains of someone who had died centuries ago. The bones seemed to be arranging themselves into a more human-like posture, and I had the terrifying realization that whatever consciousness inhabited those ancient remains was preparing to manifest more fully in our physical world. The computer screen suddenly went completely black, and all the equipment in the radiology suite powered down simultaneously, leaving me standing alone in the darkened room with only the emergency lighting to provide minimal visibility. I didn't wait to see what might happen next. I ran out of that room as fast as my trembling legs could carry me, my heart pounding so violently that I thought it might explode in my chest. I never returned to work the midnight shift at Riverside Mental Health Facility, and I submitted my resignation the following week without providing any detailed explanation for my sudden departure. The official reason I gave was personal health concerns, but I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone the truth about what I had experienced in that radiology suite during those strange, impossible midnight hours. I still don't know who or what was being scanned at 12:00 every night, or why those ancient bones had chosen our facility as a place to manifest their supernatural presence. But I'm absolutely certain that something was trying to reach out from whatever realm exists beyond death, using our own medical technology as a bridge between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. I don't work night shifts anymore, and I avoid psychiatric facilities entirely now. The memory of that smiling face, those ancient bones arranging themselves into impossible positions, and the feeling of being watched by something that should not exist in our rational, scientific world, has changed my understanding of reality in ways I'm still trying to process and accept. It started quietly, the kind of thing you'd almost dismiss if you weren't paying careful attention to the small details that make up the fabric of daily life at Riverside Mental Health Facility. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, or perhaps the accumulated stress of working too many double shifts beginning to affect my perception of reality. But when it happened again and again, night after night, I couldn't deny that something was fundamentally wrong with the staff break room. It's a small thing, really, when you think about it logically. The break room door is completely unremarkable, just like every other door in this sprawling psychiatric facility. It's heavy, painted institutional beige, and squeaks slightly when it opens. The kind of door you expect to move only when someone physically pushes it or turns the worn brass handle. The hinges are old but functional, and the door frame has settled over the decades into a comfortable, predictable routine. But at exactly 3:04 in the morning, every single night without exception, that door opens by itself. And when it does, it's always accompanied by the same haunting discovery. Rebecca's coffee mug, sitting exactly where she left it on the break room table, still warm to the touch as if she had just stepped away for a moment. When Rebecca Torres, a nurse I had worked closely with for almost 3 years, passed away unexpectedly, it devastated our entire team at Riverside. She wasn't just another colleague sharing the burden of caring for psychiatric patients. She was the heart and soul of our night shift crew. Rebecca had been one of those extraordinary nurses who never complained about the difficult cases, who always seemed to know exactly what to say to calm even the most agitated patients, and who could walk into the most chaotic situation and somehow make everything feel manageable again. She had this remarkable gift for connecting with people who had been abandoned by society, forgotten by their families, or written off by other medical professionals. Rebecca could spend hours talking with a patient, experiencing a psychotic episode, never losing her patience, never raising her voice, always finding some small thread of humanity to hold on to when everything else seemed lost. No one had seen her death coming, and the official report of suicide by drug overdose shocked every person who thought they knew her well. Rebecca was the kind of person who would never let anyone see how much pain she was carrying inside. She kept her own struggles hidden behind that warm, reassuring smile, wearing her professional composure like armor that protected not just herself, but everyone around her from the true depth of her suffering. Only after she was gone did we begin to piece together the signs we had missed, the subtle indicators that she was drowning in her own darkness, while spending every day helping others find their way back to the light. The night she died, the break room door opened at exactly 3:04 in the morning. At first, none of us said anything about it. We all had our own complicated ways of processing grief, our own methods for dealing with the reality that someone we cared about had chosen to end her life rather than reach out for help. Some of us threw ourselves into our work with renewed intensity. Others tried desperately to forget. But the night after Rebecca's funeral, when I was the last staff member remaining in the facility, I couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. I was sitting in the break room during my dinner break, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. I was just trying to find a few minutes of peace before returning to the intensive care ward when I heard it. The soft, unmistakable creak of the door opening slowly behind me. I glanced over, and there it was, the break room door swinging open as if moved by invisible hands. It wasn't caused by air pressure changes or a sudden draft. The ventilation system hummed quietly in the background, and the air in the room was perfectly still. The door simply opened on its own, moving with deliberate, purposeful motion until it stood completely ajar. My heart skipped several beats, but what really captured my attention and sent ice-cold chills down my spine was what I discovered next. Sitting on the break room table, exactly where Rebecca always placed it during our shared coffee breaks, was her favorite mug. It was the same chipped ceramic cup with faded purple flowers painted around the rim that she had used every single night for as long as I had known her. No one had touched that mug since the night she died. It hadn't been washed, hadn't been moved, hadn't been disturbed in any way. The housekeeping staff had been instructed to leave it exactly as Rebecca had left it, a small memorial to her presence in our daily routine. But now, as I reached out tentatively to touch it, I discovered something that defied all logical explanation. The mug was warm. Not just slightly warm, as if it had been sitting under the fluorescent lights for hours, but genuinely warm, as if it contained fresh, hot coffee that had just been poured. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing through every possible rational explanation. Had someone else been in the break room before me? Had the heating system somehow caused the ceramic to retain unusual amounts of heat? But I knew that none of those explanations made sense. I had been the only person in this section of the facility for the past 2 hours, and the mug had been sitting in the same spot, untouched and apparently lifeless, when I had entered the room 30 minutes earlier. I felt a chill run through my entire body as I carefully placed the mug back on the table and backed away toward the door. I left the break room that night without saying a word to anyone, because I wasn't sure I could believe what I had experienced myself, let alone convince anyone else that something supernatural was occurring. But from that night forward, it happened again and again, with clockwork regularity. Every night at exactly 3:04 in the morning, the break room door would creak open, and there it would be. Rebecca's coffee mug, sitting on the table, always warm, always waiting, as if she had just stepped out for a moment and would return at any second. No one else ever witnessed the door opening except me. I never told anyone about what I was experiencing because it felt too strange, too impossible to discuss without sounding like I was having my own break with reality. But it wasn't just the mug or the mysterious door that kept me awake during those long night shifts. It was the overwhelming feeling of Rebecca's presence that seemed to linger in that room, in that space where she had once shared stories and laughter with all of us. Her life had ended abruptly and tragically, but something intangible, something essential about who she had been, was refusing to let go of the place where she had found comfort and companionship during her darkest professional hours. I could feel it like an invisible pulse beneath the surface of the room's ordinary appearance, a spiritual energy that seemed to be holding onto the memory of better times. I couldn't bring myself to discuss this phenomenon with the other nurses. They were either too overwhelmed with their own patient responsibilities, too emotionally exhausted to care about paranormal possibilities, or too skeptical to take seriously what I was experiencing. And honestly, I was starting to doubt my own sanity. Could grief really create such vivid, consistent hallucinations? Could the mind really manufacture physical sensations like warmth and movement when desperately seeking connection with someone who was gone forever? But as the weeks passed, and the mug continued to appear warm every single night, I began to wonder if Rebecca's spirit was trying to communicate something important to those of us she had left behind. Did she need to be remembered in some specific way? Was she trying to send us a message that we weren't understanding? Was there something she needed us to know about her final days? Something that might help us make sense of why she had chosen to end her life? I started keeping a detailed log, recording the exact time the door opened each night, noting the temperature in the room, documenting the condition of the mug, and writing down any other unusual phenomena I observed. Every single entry told the same story. 3:04 in the morning, door opens by itself. Mug is warm despite having been untouched for hours. There were nights when I would deliberately stay in the break room just to watch, hoping I might witness something that would help me understand what was happening. But all I would ever experience was the soft sound of the door opening, followed by that heavy, expectant silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The mug would be there, warm and waiting, and I would feel that same profound sense of loneliness, as if Rebecca was sitting there with me, hoping I would finally understand whatever message she was trying to convey. I thought many times about confronting the situation directly, about speaking aloud to whatever presence seemed to inhabit that room. But I was terrified of disturbing something that, in its own mysterious way, felt like Rebecca's final attempt to say goodbye. She had been so private, so protective of her inner struggles during her life. Maybe she just needed to be remembered and honored in this quiet, personal way. But I couldn't ignore the situation forever. The door kept opening at 3:04 every morning, and each time, that ceramic mug remained mysteriously warm, as if Rebecca was still there, still part of our daily routine, still waiting for someone to join her for one last conversation over coffee. I still don't have definitive answers about what I experienced during those months. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the break room, I wonder if Rebecca's spirit will ever find the peace necessary to move on from Riverside Mental Health Facility. Maybe she's waiting for us to fully understand something we're not yet ready to comprehend. Or maybe she's simply trying to remind us that even after death, the connections we form with the people we care about never truly disappear. That warm mug might have been her way of saying, "I'm still here, and I need you to know that our friendship meant everything to me, even when I couldn't find the words to tell you how much I was struggling." I don't know when or if these nightly visitations will ever stop, but I've made peace with the mystery. Sometimes the most important messages come to us in ways we never expect, and sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone we've lost is simply acknowledging that their presence continues to matter, even when they can no longer speak for themselves. It had been one of those exceptionally long nights that seemed to stretch endlessly through the early morning hours. The kind of shift that tests every aspect of your professional training and personal endurance. Working in the intensive care unit at Riverside Mental Health Facility during overnight hours requires a special kind of mental resilience, an ability to maintain focus and compassion even when exhaustion begins to cloud your judgment, and the weight of human suffering feels almost overwhelming. Usual rhythm of our psychiatric intensive care ward had settled into its familiar nighttime pattern. The soft, steady hum of life support equipment providing a technological soundtrack to the quiet drama of human recovery and struggle. The gentle shuffle of nursing staff making their hourly rounds through dimly lit corridors, and the occasional murmured conversations between medical personnel discussing treatment plans and medication adjustments for our most critically ill patients. But that particular night, something completely unexpected occurred. Something that challenged everything I thought I understood about the fundamental nature of life, death, and the mysterious processes that govern the transition between these two seemingly absolute states of existence. It was approximately 4:30 in the morning when I received the standard notification that Jonathan Mitchell, a patient who had been under our care for the past 6 weeks, had passed away during the night shift. Jonathan was a 47-year-old man who had been struggling with severe treatment-resistant depression, complicated by chronic medical conditions that had made his recovery particularly challenging and uncertain. His case had been especially difficult for our entire medical team. Jonathan had been admitted to Riverside after a serious suicide attempt that had left him in a coma for several days, and his subsequent psychiatric treatment had been complicated by underlying cardiovascular problems that limited our pharmaceutical options and made traditional therapeutic interventions less effective than we had hoped. Over the weeks that followed his admission, Jonathan had shown minimal signs of improvement. His depression remained profound and seemingly impenetrable. His physical condition continued to deteriorate despite aggressive medical intervention, and his family had been prepared for the possibility that he might not survive his current hospitalization. The combination of severe mental illness and serious physical health problems had created a situation where recovery seemed increasingly unlikely with each passing day. Dr. Patricia Wells, our chief psychiatrist, had worked extensively with Jonathan's case, consulting with cardiologists, neurologists, and other specialists to develop a comprehensive treatment plan that addressed both his psychiatric symptoms and his underlying medical complications. But despite these collaborative efforts, Jonathan's condition had continued to decline gradually over the past several weeks, and his death, while deeply saddening, was not entirely unexpected given the severity of his multiple health challenges. When I received the call informing me that Jonathan had died peacefully in his sleep sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning, my initial response was the professional mixture of grief and acceptance that comes with working in intensive psychiatric care. Death is an unfortunate but inevitable reality in our field, particularly when dealing with patients whose mental illnesses are complicated by serious physical health problems that compromise their overall chances of recovery. I walked into Jonathan's room with the quiet resolve and systematic approach that these situations require. There are specific procedures that must be followed when a patient passes away in a psychiatric facility. Protocols designed to ensure that proper documentation is completed, that family members are notified appropriately, and that the deceased is treated with dignity and respect during the transition from medical care to mortuary services. As I entered room 412, I immediately noticed the profound stillness that characterizes spaces where death has recently occurred. The medical equipment that had been monitoring Jonathan's vital signs throughout his stay was now silent. The machines that had tracked his heart rate and blood pressure displaying flat lines that confirmed what we already knew. The room felt different somehow, charged with the weight of a life that had just ended, heavy with the significance of a human story that had reached its final chapter. Jonathan lay peacefully in his hospital bed, his once strong frame now appearing frail and diminished by weeks of illness. and the gradual shutdown of his body's essential systems. The harsh fluorescent lighting had been dimmed to a more respectful level, and the room was arranged with the careful attention to dignity that our facility maintains for patients who have passed away under our care. I began the necessary procedures with methodical precision, checking for any pulse or signs of respiratory activity that might have been missed by the monitoring equipment. Even though I knew that these efforts were merely part of the required protocol, rather than genuine attempts at resuscitation. Jonathan's skin was cool to the touch. His eyes were closed peacefully, and there was no indication of breathing or circulation that would suggest any remaining signs of life. Following standard procedure, I prepared to cover Jonathan's body with a clean sheet and begin the process of notifying the appropriate departments about his death. The mortuary service would need to be contacted. His family would need to be informed about the arrangements for claiming his remains, and various administrative offices would need to be notified to update his medical records and close his case file. But as I reached for the sheet that would cover Jonathan's face and upper body, something absolutely impossible occurred, something that defied every principle of medical science and challenged everything I believed about the absolute nature of death. I heard a faint rustling sound coming from the direction of Jonathan's bed, a soft noise that could have been caused by the air conditioning system or the settling of fabric, but which seemed somehow more purposeful and deliberate than random environmental sounds. I stopped what I was doing and listened more carefully, wondering if I was hearing something from the hallway outside, or perhaps the movement of medical equipment in an adjacent room. Then it happened. Jonathan's eyes opened slowly, blinking in the dim lighting as if he were waking from a deep, peaceful sleep rather than returning from clinical death. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, I stood frozen beside his bed, my heart pounding with such intensity that I thought it might explode in my chest. This was medically impossible. Jonathan had been pronounced dead by qualified medical personnel. His vital signs had been absent for over an hour, and his body had already begun showing the early physical signs of death that occur when circulation and respiration cease permanently. Yet there he was, looking directly at me with eyes that were alert, focused, and unmistakably alive. Before I could fully process what was happening, before the shock and disbelief could settle into some kind of rational response, Jonathan slowly began to sit up in his bed. His movements were deliberate, but somewhat unsteady, as though he were indeed waking from an extended period of unconsciousness, rather than returning from whatever realm exists beyond the boundary of human life. I stepped back from his bedside, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me as I tried to comprehend what I was witnessing. Every aspect of my medical training told me that what I was seeing was impossible, that people who have been clinically dead for extended periods do not simply return to consciousness as if they had been taking a nap. "Where am I?" Jonathan asked, his voice hoarse and weak, but clearly audible and coherent. He looked around the room with obvious confusion, as if he were trying to orient himself in unfamiliar surroundings. "You're in Riverside Mental Health Facility," I managed to stammer, though my voice was trembling with shock and uncertainty. "Jonathan, you were. We thought you had." I couldn't bring myself to complete the sentence, couldn't find words to describe the impossible situation that was unfolding before my eyes. I don't remember being here, he said, his brow furrowed with concentration as he tried to access memories that seemed to be just beyond his reach. I was somewhere else, somewhere very different. I was traveling, I think, but I can't remember how I got there or how long I was away. The word traveling sent chills down my spine. Where could Jonathan have been traveling during the hours when his body had shown no signs of life? What kind of journey takes place when consciousness separates from physical existence? Traveling, I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady, while my mind raced through possible explanations for what was occurring. Yes, Jonathan said, his voice growing slightly stronger as he became more alert and aware of his surroundings. I was with other people, but I can't see their faces clearly now. It was peaceful there, very quiet and calm. I felt better than I had in years, like all the depression and anxiety that had been weighing me down for so long had just disappeared. But then something changed, and I knew I had to come back. I don't understand why, but I felt like there were things I still needed to do here, people I needed to talk to, experiences I hadn't finished yet. As Jonathan spoke, I realized that I needed to alert other medical personnel immediately. This situation was far beyond my ability to handle alone. And if Jonathan had indeed returned from clinical death, there would be numerous medical, legal, and administrative implications that would need to be addressed by our entire healthcare team. I pressed the emergency call button, and within minutes, Dr. Wells arrived along with several other nurses and a physician's assistant who had been working the night shift. Their faces reflected the same mixture of disbelief and professional concern that I was experiencing as they began conducting a comprehensive medical evaluation of Jonathan's current condition. His vital signs were not only present, but remarkably stable for someone who had supposedly been deceased for over an hour. His heart rate was steady and strong. His blood pressure was within normal ranges, and his respiratory function appeared to be completely normal. Most remarkably, his overall demeanor seemed dramatically improved compared to his condition during the weeks leading up to his apparent death. The severe depression that had characterized Jonathan's entire stay at Riverside appeared to have lifted completely. He was alert, engaged, and curious about his surroundings in ways that we had never observed during his previous treatment. It was as if whatever experience he had undergone during his absence from life had somehow resolved the psychological issues that had brought him to our facility in the first place. "How are you feeling, Jonathan?" Dr. Wells asked, her voice carefully controlled, but obviously filled with amazement at what she was witnessing. "I feel wonderful," Jonathan replied with a clarity and enthusiasm that was completely unlike his previous presentations. "Better than I've felt in many years, actually. The depression is gone, completely gone. I don't understand how or why, but I feel like myself again for the first time in decades. Can you tell us what you remember about the past few hours?" Dr. Wells continued, clearly struggling to maintain her professional composure while dealing with a situation that challenged fundamental medical principles. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, as if he were trying to access memories that were difficult to retrieve or articulate in conventional language. "I remember being very sick, very tired and sad," he said slowly. "And then I remember letting go, just allowing myself to stop fighting and accept whatever was going to happen. The next thing I knew, I was somewhere else entirely." It wasn't like a dream or a hallucination. It was more real than this room, more vivid than any experience I've ever had. I was in a place that felt like home, surrounded by a sense of love and acceptance that I had never experienced before. There were other people there, but I can't describe them clearly because they weren't like people here. They were more like presences, like pure love and understanding in human form. They told me things, important things about life and death, and the connections between all living beings. They helped me understand that my depression and suffering hadn't been meaningless, that it had been part of a larger process of learning and growth that I needed to experience before I could move on to whatever comes next. But then they also told me that it wasn't my time yet, that I had more work to do in this world before I would be ready for the next stage of existence. They said I needed to come back and share what I had learned, to help other people who were struggling with the same kind of darkness that had consumed me for so many years. As Jonathan spoke, everyone in the room listened with rapt attention, trying to process the implications of what he was describing. His account of a near-death experience was remarkable enough, but the fact that he was giving this description after having been clinically dead for an extended period made it something far more extraordinary and significant. Dr. Wells ordered a comprehensive series of medical tests to evaluate Jonathan's current physical and neurological condition, wanting to ensure that his apparent recovery wasn't masking any underlying health problems that might require immediate treatment. But every examination revealed the same remarkable results. Jonathan appeared to be in excellent health, with no signs of the cardiovascular problems or other medical complications that had characterized his condition prior to his death. Over the following days, as news of Jonathan's extraordinary experience spread throughout Riverside Mental Health Facility, he became something of a phenomenon among both staff and patients. People who had been struggling with their own mental health issues sought him out, hoping to gain insight or inspiration from his unique perspective on depression, recovery, and the possibility of healing that exists even in the most hopeless situations. Jonathan was eventually discharged from our facility, completely cured of the depression that had brought him to us, and apparently free from the physical health problems that had complicated his treatment. He went on to become an advocate for mental health awareness, sharing his story with other patients and families who were dealing with similar challenges. But for those of us who witnessed his return from death, Jonathan's experience raised profound questions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between mental and physical health, and the possibility that healing can occur through processes that extend far beyond conventional medical intervention. I never fully understood what happened to Jonathan Mitchell during those hours when his body showed no signs of life, or how his consciousness was able to return from whatever realm he had visited during his apparent death. But his experience taught me to be more open to possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional medical science, and to recognize that the human spirit possesses resources for healing and recovery that we are only beginning to understand. Sometimes, when I'm working with patients who seem to be losing hope, who feel trapped by depression or other mental illnesses that appear insurmountable, I think about Jonathan's journey and the message he brought back from whatever place exists beyond the veil of death. His story serves as a reminder that healing is always possible, that consciousness is more resilient and adaptable than we often realize, and that the connections between life and death, suffering and recovery, despair and hope, are far more complex and mysterious than anything we learned in medical school. The truth is, I don't know if Jonathan's experience was real in any objective sense, or if it represented some kind of neurological phenomenon that occurred during the process of clinical death and revival. But I do know that his transformation was genuine and lasting, and that his story has continued to provide hope and inspiration to countless people who have heard it over the years since his remarkable recovery. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson from Jonathan's experience is not about the medical mechanics of life and death, but about the incredible capacity of the human spirit to find meaning, purpose, and healing, even in the darkest and most hopeless circumstances. Sometimes, the most profound recoveries occur through processes that we cannot measure, explain, or replicate, but which remind us that consciousness and healing extend far beyond the limits of our current scientific understanding. There's something fundamentally unsettling that you need to understand about Ward 7 at Riverside Mental Health Facility. Something that goes far beyond the obvious challenges of caring for severely mentally ill patients who have been deemed too dangerous or unstable for standard psychiatric treatment. It's not just the patients themselves who seem disturbed and disconnected from reality. There's something wrong with the physical space itself, something that permeates the very walls, floors, and atmosphere of that entire section of our facility. Ward 7 houses our most challenging cases. Patients with violent psychotic episodes, individuals with severe personality disorders who have proven resistant to conventional therapeutic interventions, and those unfortunate souls who exist in the gray area between criminal behavior and genuine mental illness. These are people who have been failed by other institutions, abandoned by their families, and written off by much of the medical community as untreatable or beyond hope of meaningful recovery. But even taking into account the inherent difficulties of working with such a troubled population, there was always something else present in Ward 7. Something that couldn't be explained by standard psychiatric theory or attributed to the challenging behavior of our patients. It was a presence that seemed to hover just beneath the surface of normal hospital operations, manifesting in ways that were subtle enough to be dismissed individually, but persistent enough to create a cumulative sense of dread among everyone who spent significant time in that area. People don't discuss it openly outside the walls of Ward 7, but it's impossible to ignore once you've experienced it yourself. The moment you step through the security doors that separate this high-risk psychiatric unit from the rest of Riverside, you become aware of a constant, low-frequency humming sound that seems to emanate from the building itself, rather than from any identifiable mechanical source. At first, everyone assumed it was simply some kind of maintenance issue, a minor malfunction in the building's complex network of heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. The sound wasn't particularly loud or disruptive, but it was persistent and omnipresent, like a distant engine running at low speed somewhere within the walls of the facility. You couldn't quite locate where it was coming from, but it was always there, creeping under the surface of every conversation, every medical procedure, and every moment of silence throughout the entire ward. The humming became a constant background soundtrack to our daily work routine, just loud enough to be noticed by anyone who spent more than a few minutes in Ward 7, but not quite intrusive enough to interfere with normal hospital operations. However, for the patients, those individuals whose mental stability was already compromised by severe psychiatric conditions, the sound represented something far more sinister and threatening than a simple mechanical annoyance. Over the weeks and months that followed the first reports of the mysterious humming, we began to notice that our patients were becoming increasingly agitated and disturbed by the persistent sound. Those who were capable of coherent communication would complain about the noise, describing it as a form of psychological torture that prevented them from sleeping, concentrating, or finding any peace within their already troubled minds. The humming seemed to burrow itself into their consciousness like a parasitic presence, feeding on their existing mental instabilities and amplifying their symptoms in ways that made effective treatment increasingly difficult. Patients who had been making progress in their therapy began to regress. Individuals who had been responsive to medication started showing signs of renewed psychotic episodes, and the overall atmosphere of Ward 7 began to deteriorate in measurable and concerning ways. Maintenance personnel were called in repeatedly to investigate the source of the humming sound. Teams of technicians conducted comprehensive inspections of the heating and cooling systems, examined every piece of electrical equipment in the ward, checked all the plumbing and water circulation systems, and even brought in specialized acoustic engineers to analyze the sound patterns and identify potential sources within the building's infrastructure. But each investigation came up completely empty. There was no mechanical explanation for the humming, no faulty equipment that could be repaired or replaced, no structural problems that could account for the persistent low-frequency sound that continued to plague Ward 7 day and night. The building's systems were all functioning normally, yet the humming persisted with clockwork regularity, as if it had become a permanent feature of the ward's environment. As a psychiatric nurse with over 15 years of experience working in high-security mental health facilities, I had developed the ability to adapt to unusual situations and find ways to function effectively even in challenging and stressful environments. You learn to cope with strange behaviors, unexpected outbursts, and the general unpredictability that comes with caring for people whose mental states can change dramatically without warning. But this humming sound was different from anything I had encountered in my professional career. It wasn't just an environmental annoyance or a minor distraction from our important work. There was something about the particular frequency and tone of the sound that seemed designed to create psychological discomfort, to penetrate beneath conscious awareness, and trigger primitive anxieties that most people don't even realize they possess. The sound had a quality that made it feel almost alive, as if it possessed some kind of malevolent intelligence that was deliberately targeting the most vulnerable aspects of human consciousness. It seemed to know exactly how to exploit the existing mental fragilities of our patients, amplifying their fears, intensifying their paranoid delusions, and creating an atmosphere of psychological oppression that made recovery increasingly unlikely. But there was one nurse among our staff who began to interpret the humming sound in a dramatically different way. Someone whose perspective challenged all our assumptions about what we were experiencing in Ward 7. Her name was Linda Morrison, and she had been working in psychiatric care for nearly 2 decades, long enough to develop insights and intuitions about mental illness that often proved more accurate than formal diagnostic procedures. Linda was older and more experienced than most of our team, with a calm, methodical approach to patient care that had earned her the respect of both colleagues and administrators. She was the kind of nurse who didn't panic during crisis situations, who seemed to understand the deeper psychological needs of even the most disturbed patients, and who had a reputation for remaining rational and level-headed, even when dealing with the most challenging aspects of psychiatric medicine. One evening, after a particularly difficult shift, during which several patients had experienced severe behavioral episodes that required emergency intervention, Linda approached me near the nurse's station with an expression that immediately captured my attention. She looked tired, but there was something else in her eyes, a kind of knowing concern that suggested she had been thinking deeply about something important. "Catherine," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure our conversation wouldn't be overheard by other staff members, "I need to tell you something about that humming sound, something I've been observing that I think you should know about." I was surprised by the serious tone in her voice. Linda had never been one for dramatic theories or supernatural explanations, so her obvious concern about the humming phenomenon immediately made me pay closer attention to what she was saying. "What have you noticed?" I asked, genuinely curious about what insights she might have developed during her years of experience in Ward 7. Linda hesitated for a moment, as if she was carefully considering how to phrase something that might sound incredible or unbelievable to someone who hadn't spent as much time observing the patterns she had identified. "It's not just a random sound," she said finally, her voice measured and deliberate. "It's not some mechanical malfunction or structural problem with the building. There's a pattern to it, a purpose behind when it gets louder or softer. And I think it's connected to something much more significant than we've been willing to acknowledge." The way she spoke made something cold and uncomfortable stir in my chest. For the first time since the humming had started, I found myself wondering if there might be something more supernatural or inexplicable occurring in Ward 7 than we had been prepared to consider. "What kind of pattern?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to hear her answer. Linda looked directly at me, her expression grave and slightly troubled. "I've been keeping track, making notes about when the humming changes, when it becomes more intense or seems to fade into the background. And I've discovered something that I think you need to be aware of, something that changes everything about how we should be thinking about this situation." She paused, glancing around again to ensure our privacy, then continued in an even lower voice. "The humming isn't just a noise, Catherine. It's a warning system, a signal that something is about to happen. Every time the sound intensifies, every time it becomes more noticeable and intrusive, one of our patients dies within the next 24 to 48 hours." Her words hit me like a physical blow, challenging everything I thought I understood about the mysterious sound that had been plaguing Ward 7 for months. A warning system, a predictor of death. The implications of what Linda was suggesting were far more disturbing than anything I had been prepared to consider. "Are you certain about this pattern?" I asked, though something deep in my intuition was already beginning to recognize the truth in what she was telling me. "I've been documenting it for the past 2 months," Linda replied, her voice filled with quiet conviction. 17 patients have died in Ward 7 during that time period, and in every single case, the humming became noticeably louder and more persistent in the days immediately preceding their death. It's not a coincidence, Catherine. Something is using that sound to announce when death is approaching. The more I thought about Linda's observations, the more they began to make sense of experiences I had been having, but hadn't been able to interpret properly. There had been times when the humming seemed particularly intrusive and disturbing, when it felt like the sound was trying to communicate something urgent and important. And now that Linda had pointed out the pattern, I realized that those episodes had indeed coincided with patient deaths that occurred shortly afterward. "What do you think it means?" I asked, though I suspected that neither of us had answers to such a profound and disturbing question. "I don't know," Linda admitted, "but I think we need to start paying much closer attention to the sound patterns, and we need to be prepared for what might happen when the humming becomes more intense than usual." As the weeks continued, I found myself listening to the humming with new awareness and growing anxiety. Linda's theory had fundamentally changed my perception of the sound, transforming it from a minor environmental annoyance into something that felt like a supernatural harbinger of death. Every fluctuation in volume or intensity now carried ominous implications. Every change in the sound's characteristics seemed to suggest that someone in Ward 7 was approaching the end of their life. But there was one patient in particular who seemed to have a different relationship with the humming sound, someone whose responses to the mysterious phenomenon provided insights that none of the rest of us had been able to develop. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she had been a long-term resident of Ward 7 for almost 3 years, a patient whose complex psychiatric condition had made her a permanent fixture in our high-security unit. Margaret's diagnosis was complicated and multifaceted, involving elements of schizophrenia, severe depression, and dissociative episodes that made her difficult to treat with conventional therapeutic approaches. But she was also one of our most lucid and articulate patients, someone who was capable of extended conversations and thoughtful observations about her environment when her symptoms were well controlled with medication. Unlike most of our other patients, Margaret didn't seem disturbed or agitated by the persistent humming sound. In fact, she appeared to find some kind of comfort or reassurance in the mysterious noise, as if it provided her with information or companionship that the rest of us couldn't access or understand. One evening, after another patient had died unexpectedly during the night shift, Margaret approached me quietly near her room with an expression that suggested she had something important she wanted to share. Her eyes were clearer and more focused than I had seen them in weeks, and there was an urgency in her demeanor that immediately captured my attention. "Nurse Catherine," she said softly, "I need to tell you about the humming. I need to explain what it really is, because I don't think you understand what's happening in this ward." I was intrigued by her serious tone and the apparent clarity of her thinking. Margaret rarely initiated conversations with staff members, and when she did speak, her comments were often fragmented or difficult to follow due to her psychiatric symptoms. But this time, she seemed remarkably coherent and purposeful. "What can you tell me about it?" I asked, genuinely interested in her perspective on the phenomenon that had been troubling everyone in Ward 7. Margaret glanced around the hallway, ensuring that no other patients or staff members were within hearing distance, then looked directly at me with an intensity that was both compelling and slightly unsettling. "It's not just a sound," she said quietly. "It's not some mechanical problem or building issue like everyone thinks. The humming is a voice, a way of communicating with those of us who are close enough to death to understand what it's trying to say." Her words sent chills down my spine, but there was something in her tone, a conviction and clarity that made it impossible to dismiss her observations as mere psychiatric delusion. "What do you mean it's trying to communicate?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear her explanation. "It tells us things," Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "It warns us about what's coming, helps us prepare for transitions that most people are too afraid to acknowledge or accept. The humming knows when someone is ready to leave this world, and it tries to make the process less frightening for those who are willing to listen. The sound gets louder when death is approaching, because it's trying to reach the person who needs to hear it most. It's not meant to be scary or threatening. It's meant to be comforting, a reminder that dying doesn't have to be a lonely or terrifying experience." As Margaret spoke, I found myself reconsidering everything I thought I understood about the mysterious humming that had been affecting Ward 7 for so many months. Could it really be some kind of supernatural communication system, a bridge between life and death that was trying to provide comfort and guidance to people in their final moments? The next morning, something occurred that seemed to validate Margaret's interpretation of the humming sound in the most profound and disturbing way possible. Another patient, a man named Robert, who had been struggling with severe bipolar disorder for most of his adult life, was found dead in his room during the early morning wellness check. But Robert's death was different from the others we had experienced in Ward 7. There was no sign of medical crisis, no indication of suicide or violent episode. He appeared to have simply passed away peacefully in his sleep, with a calm, serene expression that suggested his final moments had been free from the psychological torment that had characterized most of his life. And in the hours immediately following Robert's death, something extraordinary happened. The humming sound that had been a constant presence in Ward 7 for months suddenly stopped completely, leaving behind a silence that felt deeper and more profound than anything we had experienced since the mysterious phenomenon had begun. The silence lasted for exactly 48 hours, during which time the entire atmosphere of Ward 7 seemed to change. Patients who had been agitated and disturbed by the humming became noticeably calmer. Staff members reported feeling less anxious and stressed, and the overall environment of the ward felt more peaceful and manageable than it had in months. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the humming returned. But this time, it seemed different somehow, less intrusive and threatening, more like a gentle presence that was simply part of the ward's environment rather than an ominous harbinger of approaching death. I never fully understood what Margaret meant when she described the humming as a form of communication between the living and the dead, or how she seemed to know that the sound was intended to provide comfort rather than create fear. But after Robert's peaceful death and the temporary silence that followed, I began to wonder if there might be aspects of human consciousness and mortality that extend far beyond our conventional understanding of life and death. The humming continues in Ward 7, though it no longer fills me with the same sense of dread and foreboding that it once did. I've learned to think of it as Margaret described it, not as a threat or a warning of impending doom, but as a reminder that even in death, none of us are truly alone. Sometimes, when the facility is particularly quiet and the sound seems most noticeable, I imagine it as a kind of spiritual presence that watches over our most vulnerable patients, offering them comfort and companionship during their darkest moments. I don't know if Margaret's interpretation of the humming was accurate, or if the strange patterns that Linda observed were merely coincidental. But I do know that working in Ward 7 taught me to be more open to possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional medical science, and to respect the mysterious forces that seem to operate in places where human suffering and healing intersect in such concentrated and profound ways. I've been working as a radiology technician at Riverside Mental Health Facility for over 12 years. And in all that time, I have encountered countless situations that tested the boundaries of what I considered normal, rational, or explainable within the context of modern psychiatric medicine. The nature of our work naturally exposes us to the unusual, the unexpected, and sometimes the genuinely unsettling aspects of human behavior and mental illness. But there was one particular location within our sprawling facility that consistently made me uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with the challenging nature of psychiatric care or the emotional demands of working with severely mentally ill patients. It was a place that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of hospital operations, a forgotten corner of Riverside that had been abandoned for practical reasons, but never quite managed to shake off the lingering sense of unfinished business. The old radiology suite was located in the eastern wing of the building, tucked away in what had once been the heart of our diagnostic imaging department, before the facility underwent major renovations and modernization efforts in the early 2000s. This section of Riverside had been constructed in the late 1970s, during an era when psychiatric hospitals were built with functionality rather than comfort in mind, resulting in long, dimly lit corridors and small, cramped rooms that felt more like institutional storage areas than medical treatment facilities. When the hospital administration decided to consolidate all diagnostic imaging services into a new, state-of-the-art radiology department on the opposite side of the building, the old suite was simply sealed off and forgotten. The outdated equipment was deemed too expensive to relocate and too obsolete to justify continued maintenance. So it was left exactly as it had been on the final day of operation, like a medical time capsule, frozen in a moment of abandonment. The room itself wasn't particularly remarkable from an architectural standpoint. It was small, barely large enough to accommodate the massive X-ray machines and developing equipment that had been standard in the psychiatric medical field 20 years earlier. The walls were painted institutional beige. The fluorescent lighting fixtures had begun to flicker inconsistently due to aging electrical systems, and the linoleum flooring showed the wear patterns of decades of medical staff moving equipment and patients through the confined space. But despite its unremarkable appearance, There was something about that abandoned radiology suite that consistently triggered a profound sense of unease in anyone who spent time near it. It wasn't just the natural discomfort that comes from being in unused, deteriorating spaces within an active medical facility. There was a psychological weight to the atmosphere in that room, a feeling of being observed and evaluated by invisible presences that seemed to linger in the shadows between the obsolete medical equipment. At first, I attributed these sensations to nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination, combined with the natural stress that comes from working night shifts in a psychiatric hospital. The mind has a tendency to create patterns and assign meaning to random environmental stimuli when you're tired, isolated, and surrounded by the constant reminders of human psychological fragility. It seemed entirely reasonable that an abandoned room filled with outdated medical equipment might feel vaguely threatening or uncomfortable, especially during the quiet hours when the rest of the facility was settling into its overnight routine. But the feeling persisted and intensified over time, growing stronger rather than fading as I became more familiar with the layout and atmosphere of the Eastern Wing. Every time I walked past that sealed doorway during my rounds, I experienced the same inexplicable chill, the same sense that something was watching me from within that darkened room, waiting for an opportunity to make its presence known in more obvious and disturbing ways. I remember one particular evening, approximately 6 months ago, when I was finishing my final equipment checks before the end of my shift. It was well past 2 in the morning, and Riverside had settled into the deep quiet that characterizes psychiatric facilities during overnight hours. Most of the patients were asleep. The hallways were nearly deserted, and the only sounds were the gentle humming of essential medical equipment and the occasional soft footsteps of nurses making their security rounds through the various patient wards. I was walking through the eastern corridor, completing my routine inspection of the newer radiology equipment, when I noticed something that made me stop abruptly in the middle of the hallway. There was a shadow moving across the far end of the corridor, darting quickly from one side to the other, with the kind of deliberate motion that could only be produced by a person walking with purpose and urgency. My first assumption was that one of the other staff members was working late, perhaps responding to some kind of patient emergency that required immediate attention from the medical team. Night shifts in psychiatric facilities often involve unexpected situations that demand rapid response from multiple departments. So seeing someone moving quickly through the corridors wasn't particularly unusual in itself. But when I turned the corner to follow the shadow and see which colleague might need assistance, I found absolutely nothing. The hallway was completely empty, stretching away into the distance with no sign of human presence anywhere within my field of vision. The overhead lighting was functioning normally. There were no objects or equipment that could have created moving shadows, and the ventilation system was operating quietly without any fluctuations that might cause changes in air pressure or lighting conditions. I paused there in the empty corridor, trying to rationalize what I had just witnessed and find some logical explanation for the moving shadow that had caught my attention. Had I simply been more tired than I realized? Was my peripheral vision playing tricks on me after hours of focusing on detailed technical work? Had some combination of artificial lighting and architectural features created an optical illusion that my exhausted mind had interpreted as human movement. But even as I considered these reasonable explanations, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something genuinely unusual, something that couldn't be dismissed as mere fatigue or misperception. The next day, I was walking through the main corridor of the psychiatric wing when I encountered David Thompson, one of the newest interns in our radiology department. David was fresh out of medical school, eager to make a good impression, and enthusiastic about learning the practical aspects of diagnostic imaging in a psychiatric medical environment. I had seen him around the facility for several weeks, but we hadn't had many opportunities for extended conversation about his experiences at Riverside. He approached me near the nursing station with an expression that immediately caught my attention. There was something in his eyes, a combination of uncertainty and concern, that suggested he had encountered something he couldn't quite explain or understand. His usually confident demeanor seemed shaken, and he glanced around nervously, as if he was worried about being overheard by other staff members. "Catherine," he said, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't think I'm losing my mind. Is there something unusual about the old radiology suite in the Eastern Wing? Something that I should know about before I spend more time working in that area?" I was immediately struck by the specificity of his question and the obvious anxiety in his voice. It felt like he had just confirmed something I had been experiencing, but hadn't been willing to discuss with anyone else. A shared recognition of something strange and unsettling that existed in that abandoned corner of our facility. "What do you mean exactly?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral, while internally wondering what specific experiences had prompted his inquiry. David shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable with having to describe whatever had happened to him. He glanced down the hallway toward the Eastern Wing, then back at me, as if he was trying to decide how much detail he should share about his recent experiences. "Last night, when I was completing some late scanning procedures, I heard voices coming from that direction," he continued, his voice barely audible. "Not just one voice, but several people talking, whispering actually. I couldn't make out specific words, but it definitely sounded like conversations were taking place somewhere in that abandoned area. At first, I thought maybe some of the maintenance staff were working on repairs or inspections, but when I checked with security, they said no one was authorized to be in that section of the building after hours. I felt like I wasn't alone in there, like there were people standing right behind me, talking about things I couldn't understand." As David spoke, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. His description matched exactly what I had been experiencing for months, the same sense of invisible presences and unidentifiable sounds that seemed to emanate from that sealed radiology suite. But hearing someone else describe similar phenomena made the experiences feel more real, more credible, and significantly more disturbing. "You're not the first person to notice unusual things in that area," I admitted quietly, realizing that David deserved to know he wasn't imagining things or experiencing some kind of stress-related breakdown. "I've been hearing the whispers too, along with other sounds that don't seem to have any logical source." David's expression shifted from anxiety to something approaching relief. As if my confirmation had validated experiences he had been questioning and doubting. But there was also a new level of concern in his eyes. The realization that if multiple people were experiencing the same unexplained phenomena, then something genuinely unusual was occurring in that abandoned section of Riverside. "What do you think it could be?" he asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't expecting a definitive answer to such a complex question. I didn't have any satisfactory explanations to offer him. The whispers, the shadows, the overwhelming feeling of being observed by invisible presences, all of it defied rational analysis or conventional understanding of how abandoned buildings should behave. But I could share what I had learned about coping with the psychological impact of working in an environment where unexplained phenomena seemed to be a regular occurrence. "I think there are some things about this place that we're not meant to understand," I said carefully. "The best approach seems to be acknowledging that unusual things happen here, being careful not to spend unnecessary time in that area alone, and focusing on the important work we're here to do rather than trying to solve mysteries that might not have solutions." After that conversation, David and I didn't discuss the Eastern Wing phenomena again, at least not directly. He finished his internship rotation and transferred to a different department within a few months, and I eventually learned to avoid that section of the building whenever possible, finding alternate routes through the facility that didn't require me to walk past the sealed entrance to the old radiology suite. But the experiences continued sporadically over the following months. Other staff members would occasionally mention hearing unusual sounds from that direction, or feeling watched while working in the nearby areas. But no one ever reported anything dramatic enough to warrant official investigation or administrative attention. The whispers remained the most consistent and unsettling aspect of whatever was occurring in that abandoned room. They seemed to occur most frequently during the quietest hours of the night shift, when the facility was at its most peaceful, and the normal sounds of medical operations had faded to their minimum levels. The voices were always just quiet enough to be barely audible, always just indistinct enough to prevent understanding of specific words or conversations, but always clearly recognizable as human speech rather than mechanical sounds or environmental noise. Sometimes, when I was working alone in the newer radiology department, and the facility was particularly quiet, I would hear what sounded like footsteps coming from the direction of the Eastern Wing. Slow, deliberate footsteps that suggested someone was walking through those abandoned corridors with purpose and familiarity, as if they belonged there and had every right to be moving through spaces that had been sealed off from normal hospital operations. I often wondered who or what might be responsible for these ongoing manifestations, and whether the phenomena were connected to the history of psychiatric treatment that had taken place in that section of Riverside over the decades. How many patients had been diagnosed and treated in that old radiology suite? How many medical procedures had been performed there? How many difficult decisions about mental health care had been made based on images captured by that obsolete equipment? Perhaps some echo of all that human suffering and medical intervention had remained behind when the room was abandoned, creating a kind of psychological residue that continued to manifest in subtle but persistent ways. Or perhaps the combination of isolation, outdated equipment, and institutional history had simply created an environment where the boundary between rational explanation and supernatural possibility became blurred enough to allow unusual phenomena to occur. I don't work in the eastern wing anymore, and I make it a point to avoid that section of Riverside whenever my duties allow for alternate routes through the facility. The whispers and shadows may continue in that abandoned radiology suite, but I've decided that some mysteries are better left unexplored, especially when they involve potential contact with whatever forces or presences might be drawn to places where human vulnerability and medical intervention intersect in such concentrated ways. Sometimes, late at night when the facility is at its quietest, I still hear faint sounds that might be coming from that direction. But I've learned to focus on my current responsibilities, to concentrate on the living patients who need my expertise and attention, rather than trying to understand or communicate with whatever remains behind in the forgotten corners of our complex, troubled institution. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.